Every year, thousands of aircraft safely cross the skies above us, carrying millions of passengers to their destinations without incident. But hidden within the history of aviation are a handful of flights that never reached their final destination, and some that simply vanished from the world entirely. Welcome to Black 13, where we explore the darkest mysteries history refuses to explain. Tonight, we descend into the unsettling world of ghost flights, missing aircraft, and aviation mysteries that continue to haunt investigators decades later. These are not stories of ordinary crashes. These are cases where planes disappeared without a trace, where wreckage was found but answers were not, and where entire crews and passengers seem to vanish into the unknown. In this episode, we investigate the baffling disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. One of the greatest aviation mysteries of the modern era. We revisit the chilling story of Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, where more than 100 people vanished over the Pacific and were never seen again. We explore military aircraft lost during the Cold War, planes swallowed by mountains and oceans, and ghostly cases where search teams found debris, but never those aboard. Along the way, we'll examine theories ranging from catastrophic failures and government secrecy to witness reports so strange they continue to fuel speculation decades later. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare for a journey into the skies where radar fails, signals disappear, and some flights seem to cross an invisible boundary from which they never return. Because somewhere above the clouds lie unanswered questions, missing people, and mysteries that refuse to fade with time. And as we uncover these 6 bizarre aviation cases, you may begin to wonder whether some planes truly crash, or whether some simply vanish into the unknown. On the night of March 8th, 2014, what should have been an ordinary international flight became one of the greatest mysteries in modern history. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed Kuala Lumpur bound for Beijing, carrying 239 people from 14 nations. Families slept peacefully, believing their loved ones would arrive in a few hours. Pilots followed familiar procedures. Controllers monitored the aircraft as they had thousands before. Then, just after leaving Malaysian airspace, the plane spoke its final confirmed words to air traffic control. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Minutes later, it vanished into the darkness. Aircraft do not simply disappear in the modern world. They leave radar trails, radio transmissions, satellite signals, and digital footprints stretching across continents. Yet MH370 seemed to defy that reality. Military radar later suggested the aircraft turned sharply west, deviating from its planned route in a maneuver that investigators would later describe as deliberate. One by one, communication systems stopped transmitting. The transponder fell silent. The aircraft slipped away from civilian radar and entered the vast emptiness of the night sky above Southeast Asia. Somewhere over dark waters, with hundreds of lives aboard, the flight became a ghost. The search that followed was unlike anything in aviation history. Nations deployed ships, aircraft, satellites, and deep-sea technology across thousands of square miles of ocean. Search teams combed waters stretching from the South China Sea to the southern Indian Ocean. Yet day after day, week after week, investigators found almost nothing. The ocean seemed to swallow the aircraft whole. It was as though the plane had crossed some invisible boundary where the modern world's ability to track and understand simply ceased to exist. Then came the satellite data. Investigators discovered that long after disappearing from radar, the aircraft had continued communicating indirectly with satellites through automated electronic handshakes. Those faint signals painted a chilling picture. MH370 had apparently flown for hours into the remote southern Indian Ocean, one of the most isolated places on Earth. There were no nearby airports, no inhabited islands, no easy explanations. Somewhere over those dark waters, in a region sailors have long feared for its storms and endless emptiness, the aircraft's journey came to an end. But how and why remains uncertain. Years later, pieces of debris began washing ashore on distant beaches across the Indian Ocean. A wing flaperon discovered on Réunion Island was confirmed to belong to MH370. Additional fragments surfaced in Africa and on remote islands, carried across vast currents by the sea. These discoveries proved that the aircraft had indeed met a tragic fate, yet they also deepened the mystery. The main wreckage remained hidden beneath miles of ocean, along with the flight recorders that could reveal what happened during those final hours. The sea had returned fragments, but guarded the answers. Over the years, countless theories emerged: mechanical failure, hijacking, pilot involvement, fire, decompression, government secrecy. Each theory attempts to explain a puzzle with missing pieces. Some investigators believe the aircraft was intentionally diverted. Others argue that an unforeseen emergency left the plane flying on autopilot into oblivion. But despite exhaustive analysis and multiple search efforts, no explanation has satisfied every question. In a world of satellites and instant communication, MH370 remains an uncomfortable reminder that even today, there are places where people, an entire aircraft, can still disappear. More than a decade later, the mystery of Flight 370 continues to haunt the world because it touches something deeply human: the fear of uncertainty. Somewhere beneath the cold waters of the Indian Ocean lies a silent aircraft carrying the untold final moments of 239 souls. Families still wait for answers. Investigators still search for clues. And every time a plane disappears beyond the horizon, the shadow of MH370 returns. Because some mysteries fade with time, but others linger in the darkness, circling endlessly like a signal still searching for someone to answer. On the night of March 16th, 1962, a sleek chartered aircraft lifted off into the darkness over the Pacific Ocean, carrying 107 souls aboard. American servicemen and crew members bound for Southeast Asia during the uneasy years of the Cold War. The aircraft was Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, a military charter contracted to transport troops across vast stretches of ocean where the horizon seemed endless and the sky met the sea in a featureless void. It was a routine journey on paper. Thousands of military flights crossed these same routes during that era. Yet before the sun would rise again, Flight 739 would become the largest unsolved mass disappearance in aviation history. The aircraft made its scheduled stop in Guam and departed into the night toward the Philippines. Communications were normal. Weather conditions were considered acceptable. Nothing in the radio transmissions suggested distress, mechanical trouble, or danger. Then, without warning, the aircraft simply ceased to exist. No Mayday call was ever received, no emergency beacon activated, no final transmission hinted at catastrophe. One moment the aircraft was crossing the Pacific under a blanket of stars. The next, it vanished into one of the most remote regions on Earth. The mystery deepened when another vessel entered the story. A Liberian tanker traveling hundreds of miles away reported witnessing something extraordinary that same night. A brilliant flash of light in the sky followed by what appeared to be an explosion high above the ocean. Crew members described seeing a fiery object descend into the darkness before disappearing beyond the horizon. The timing roughly matched Flight 739's expected route. Was this the final fate of the aircraft, or was it an unrelated event lost in the immensity of the Pacific? Investigators could never say with certainty. What followed was one of the largest search operations of its time. Military aircraft scoured vast stretches of open water. Ships searched wave after wave beneath an endless sky. Thousands of square miles of ocean were examined in hopes of finding wreckage, survivors, or even the faintest trace of what had occurred. Yet the Pacific gave up nothing. No debris field, no life rafts, no bodies, not a single confirmed piece of the aircraft was ever recovered. It was as though Flight 739 had been erased from the world entirely. The Cold War atmosphere only fueled speculation. The year was 1962, a time of espionage, covert operations, and rising tensions between global superpowers. Some theorized that sabotage had brought down the aircraft. Others whispered of secret military cargo or hidden missions never disclosed to the public. There were even rumors that intelligence agencies possessed information they never released. Without wreckage or flight recorders, every possibility remained open, and every unanswered question gave rise to another theory. Unlike many aviation disasters, Flight 739 offers no final scene. There is no crash site to visit, no recovered fuselage resting beneath the sea, no black box recording the last moments of those aboard. Instead, there is only silence, a silence stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. Families received no definitive answers. Historians still debate possibilities. Investigators continue to revisit old records, hoping a forgotten clue may one day emerge. But after more than 60 years, the Pacific still keeps its secret. Perhaps that is what makes Flight 739 so haunting. Most tragedies leave behind evidence, scars upon the landscape, or artifacts to study. This one left almost nothing. Somewhere beneath the vast Pacific, or perhaps somewhere never found at all, lies the truth of what happened to 107 people on a quiet night in 1962. Until that truth is discovered, Flight 739 remains more than an aviation mystery. It remains a ghost flight, a plane that entered the darkness above the ocean and, for reasons still unknown, never came back. In the early days of the Cold War, the world lived beneath the shadow of secrets. Nations armed themselves with weapons powerful enough to end civilization, while spies moved silently through the cracks of global politics. It was an age when entire military operations vanished behind classified stamps and locked filing cabinets. And on March 23, 1951, amid this growing tension between East and West, one of the strangest aviation mysteries in American history unfolded over the icy waters of the North Atlantic, a mystery that remains unsolved more than 70 years later. The aircraft was a massive C-124 Globemaster II, one of the largest transport planes of its era. Aboard were 53 men, crew members, military personnel, and some of the United States Air Force's most experienced officers. Among them was Brigadier General Paul Cullen, a highly respected strategist with deep ties to America's nuclear program. The aircraft departed from Maine, bound for England, carrying passengers and cargo whose full details remain debated to this day. Officially, it was a routine military transport. Unofficially, many historians suspect the flight carried personnel and information of immense strategic value during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Hours into the flight, disaster struck. The crew radioed an alarming message. A fire had broken out among the cargo. With smoke spreading and the aircraft at risk, the pilots made the difficult decision to ditch the massive plane into the frigid Atlantic Ocean hundreds of miles southwest of Ireland. Against extraordinary odds, they succeeded. Reports indicate the aircraft landed relatively intact on the water, and all 53 men escaped into inflatable life rafts equipped with food, water, flares, cold weather gear, and emergency radios. For a brief moment, it seemed the story would end not in tragedy, but survival. Then came the part that transformed an accident into a legend. A nearby B-29 aircraft arrived over the scene and observed the survivors below. Flares burned against the dark ocean. Life rafts floated on the waves. Rescue appeared inevitable. The B-29 radioed the survivors' location and circled overhead for as long as fuel allowed. But as night deepened and fuel ran low, the aircraft was forced to leave. The men below were alive. They had been seen. Their position was known. Rescue ships were already on their way. And yet when those ships arrived nearly 19 hours later, they found almost nothing. The Atlantic had become an empty grave. The life rafts were gone. The men were gone. No bodies floated on the surface. No emergency radios transmitted distress calls. Search crews recovered only a few charred fragments, a damaged life raft, and a lone briefcase drifting in the cold sea. That was all. 53 men had survived a crash into the Atlantic, only to disappear entirely afterward. The search that followed was one of the largest air and sea rescue efforts of its time, involving ships, submarines, and aircraft from multiple nations. Yet the ocean surrendered no answers. As the years passed, theories multiplied like shadows in the fog. Some believed the men succumbed to exposure in the brutal North Atlantic before rescue arrived. Others pointed toward darker possibilities. Soviet submarines were known to be operating in the area during the height of Cold War tensions. Could the survivors have been captured? Did the aircraft carry sensitive intelligence or nuclear-related cargo valuable enough to justify an extraordinary operation? The United States government released limited information about the mission, fueling decades of speculation. Even today, some researchers argue that key details remain hidden behind layers of classification and secrecy. More than 7 decades later, the mystery of the vanished Globemaster endures because it defies one of humanity's most basic expectations. Survival should have left evidence. 53 men escaped into life rafts. They had supplies, they had been seen alive. Rescue was coming, and then nothing. No remains, no final messages, no trace. Somewhere beneath the gray waters of the Atlantic lies the truth of what happened that night. Whether it was the unforgiving sea, Cold War intrigue, or something history has yet to uncover, the fate of those 53 souls remains one of aviation's most haunting disappearances. A ghost story written not in shadows but across an empty ocean. The year was 1965, and the Cold War had cast its long shadow across the world. Nations watched one another with suspicion. Military aircraft crossed continents carrying not only personnel, but secrets. It was during this tense chapter of history that an Argentine Air Force transport plane, known as TC-48, began what should have been a routine training journey. On board were 68 people, young cadets preparing for military careers, seasoned officers, and crew members who had already spent days traveling north from South America toward the United States. Many of the cadets were barely in their 20s. Some wrote letters home during the journey, unaware that they would become part of one of Latin America's greatest aviation mysteries. On the morning of November 3rd, the Douglas C-54 lifted off from Howard Air Force Base in Panama, heading toward El Salvador. A second aircraft carrying fellow cadets flew nearby, maintaining intermittent radio contact. The weather was not ideal. Rain clouds gathered over the Caribbean, and visibility shifted with the tropical atmosphere. Yet nothing initially suggested catastrophe. The flight progressed normally over the waters near Panama and Costa Rica. Then, less than an hour into the journey, the crew transmitted a chilling message. Engine number 3 was on fire, and engine 4 had stopped working. The pilots announced they would attempt an emergency diversion toward Costa Rica. Those were among the last confirmed words ever heard from the aircraft. What happened next remains shrouded in uncertainty. Air traffic controllers and nearby pilots reportedly heard fragments of additional radio traffic. One transmission suggested the crew was attempting to reach Puerto Limon in Costa Rica. Others claimed the aircraft had crossed into mountainous terrain near the remote Talamanca region. Witnesses later reported hearing a plane flying unusually low through heavy clouds. Some swore they saw an aircraft struggling against the weather above dense jungle. Then the signals stopped. The sky fell silent. A plane carrying 68 souls had vanished somewhere between sea and mountain, leaving behind only questions. The search operation that followed stretched across ocean and wilderness. Aircraft scanned the Caribbean. Ships combed coastal waters. Rescue teams ventured into some of Central America's most unforgiving terrain. Jungles so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Days later, searchers recovered life vests, pieces of debris, and personal belongings floating near the Bocas del Toro archipelago. But the discoveries only deepened the mystery. The wreckage was sparse, no fuselage, no bodies, no definitive crash site. It was as though the aircraft had been swallowed by the landscape itself. Over the decades, theories multiplied like shadows in the rainforest. Some investigators believe the aircraft ditched into the Caribbean Sea, where powerful currents carried away the evidence. Others suspect it attempted to reach land and crashed deep within the nearly impenetrable mountains of Costa Rica, where thick vegetation may still conceal its remains to this day. Local stories even emerged of survivors seen briefly in remote villages before disappearing into the wilderness. These accounts have never been verified, yet they persist, whispered from one generation to the next, like fragments of a ghost story that refuses to die. What makes the disappearance of TC-48 especially haunting is not simply that an aircraft vanished, it is who vanished with it. Many aboard were young cadets standing at the threshold of adulthood, embarking on careers that would never begin. Families waited for letters that never arrived. Parents grew old without answers. Brothers and sisters spent decades wondering whether their loved ones met their fate in the sea, the mountains, or somewhere still undiscovered. Unlike many aviation tragedies, there is no grave to visit, no memorial built around recovered wreckage. There is only absence. Nearly 60 years later, the mystery of TC-48 endures because it embodies one of humanity's deepest fears: disappearing without explanation. Somewhere beneath dense jungle canopies or beneath the dark waters of the Caribbean lies the truth of what happened on that November morning in 1965. Until it is found, the flight remains suspended between history and legend, a ghost plane lost between sky and earth, carrying with it 68 unanswered stories that refuse to fade into silence. On the night of February 29th, 1996, a date that appears on the calendar only once every 4 years, Fawcett, Peru, Flight 251 lifted off from Lima beneath darkening skies, carrying 123 souls toward the ancient city of Arequipa. It was a routine domestic flight, one traveled countless times before. Families settled into their seats. Travelers gazed out at the fading lights below. The Boeing 737 climbed into the Andean night, unaware that its final destination would not be an airport, but a lonely mountainside hidden among some of the world's most unforgiving terrain. In the high Andes of Peru, mountains do not merely rise above the earth, they loom like silent sentinels, ancient and indifferent to those who cross their domain. As the aircraft neared Arequipa, weather conditions began to deteriorate. Rain swept across the region. Fog rolled through the valleys. Thunderstorms flickered in the distance like distant artillery. The airport itself sits at an elevation of more than 8,400 feet above sea level, surrounded by jagged volcanic peaks and steep ridges that disappear into darkness after sunset. Pilots flying into the region have long respected the mountains, knowing that in poor visibility, even the slightest error can become fatal. Yet on this night, the crew believed they were higher than they truly were, a tragic miscalculation hidden behind clouds and instruments. Investigators later concluded that the aircraft had descended hundreds of feet lower than the pilots realized due to outdated altitude information and challenging conditions. Moments before impact, the crew requested that the runway lights be brightened. Air traffic control responded with unsettling news. The lights were already at maximum intensity. The runway should have been visible, but from the cockpit, there was only darkness. Imagine the scene. A modern airliner flying through rain and mist, searching desperately for lights that never appear, while unseen mountains rise silently through the blackness ahead. There was no distress call, no cry for help, only confusion and the growing realization that something was terribly wrong. Then, at 8:25 p.m., the Andes answered with stone. The aircraft struck a ridge just miles from safety. The crash site itself seemed almost designed to conceal tragedy. The tail section broke away and tumbled into a ravine, while the main fuselage continued over one ridge before impacting another. Rescue crews struggled to reach the wreckage in the darkness and rugged terrain. Rain and mountain winds swept through the site. Searchers described a haunting stillness hanging over the high-altitude landscape, as though the mountains had reclaimed what entered their domain. All 123 people aboard perished, Among them were families, tourists, and artists, including the son of one of Peru's most renowned painters. Yet what makes Flight 251 so unsettling is not merely the tragedy itself, but the eerie sequence of events leading up to it. The pilots believed they were flying safely above the terrain. Instruments suggested one reality, while the mountains held another. In aviation, pilots are trained to trust their instruments above all else. But on that night, hidden by weather and darkness, the difference between safety and disaster was measured in mere hundreds of feet. The Andes have long been surrounded by folklore, stories of travelers vanishing into fog, strange lights moving across remote peaks, and mountains that seem to swallow entire expeditions. While Flight 251 has a technical explanation, the emotional weight of its final moments remains deeply haunting. There is something uniquely unsettling about crashes in the mountains. Oceans conceal their dead beneath waves, but mountains preserve them in silence. The Andes have claimed aircraft for decades, often hiding wreckage for years beneath snow, rock, and inaccessible valleys. In many cultures, mountains are viewed not simply as landscapes, but as ancient places imbued with spiritual significance. Standing before the towering peaks around Arequipa, one cannot help but feel small, and perhaps understand why generations have believed that certain places resist human passage. Nearly 30 years later, Flight 251 remains one of Peru's deadliest aviation disasters and a haunting reminder of how quickly certainty can become confusion. On a night of rain and fog, planes searched for lights that never appeared while unseen mountains waited in the darkness. The passengers aboard likely believed they were moments from landing. Instead, they became part of a mystery written across the Andes themselves. And as winds still sweep across those lonely ridges high above Peru, one cannot help but wonder how many secrets the mountains keep, and how many stories they will never give back. The Pacific Ocean is vast beyond comprehension. Stretching across millions of square miles, its waters conceal mountain ranges taller than Everest, trenches deeper than imagination, and countless secrets lost to time. Sailors have long feared its endless horizons, not because of what they could see, but because of what could disappear without leaving a trace. It was into this immense and unforgiving expanse that Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 departed on a quiet night in March 1962. By sunrise, the aircraft and all 107 souls aboard would vanish into history, becoming one of the greatest unsolved aviation mysteries ever recorded. The aircraft, a Lockheed Super Constellation chartered by the U.S. military, carried 96 American servicemen and an 11-member crew. Most of the passengers were young soldiers traveling to Southeast Asia during the early years of escalating tensions in Vietnam. Many had families waiting for them back home. Some carried letters in their bags. Others spoke excitedly about returning after deployment. The flight had already completed part of its long trans-Pacific journey and departed from Guam shortly after midnight, bound for the Philippines. Nothing about the departure suggested danger. Weather conditions were considered normal. The crew was experienced. By every measure, it should have been an uneventful crossing over dark waters beneath a blanket of stars. Then, somewhere over the Pacific, the aircraft disappeared. There was no distress call, no emergency signal, no final transmission hinting at mechanical trouble or human error. One moment Flight 739 existed on radio schedules and flight plans. The next, it simply ceased to be. In aviation, accidents often leave clues: a mayday call, floating debris, a radar return. But Flight 739 left none. It was as though the night itself had swallowed the aircraft whole. The silence that followed would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. 107 people vanished without warning, and the world had no explanation. The mystery deepened when a report emerged from the Liberian tanker, T.L. Lenzen, traveling hundreds of miles away across the Pacific. Crew members aboard the ship claimed they had witnessed a brilliant flash in the sky around the same time the aircraft disappeared. Some described it as an explosion high above the horizon. Others recalled seeing what looked like a fireball descending into the darkness before vanishing entirely. The timing was chillingly close to Flight 739's expected route. Was it the aircraft meeting its fate in the vast emptiness above the ocean? Or had the sailors witnessed something else entirely? To this day, investigators cannot say with certainty. What followed was one of the largest air and sea searches of its era. Military aircraft swept across thousands of square miles of open water. Ships scanned the horizon day after day. Crews searched for wreckage, life rafts, oil slicks, anything that might reveal what happened. But the Pacific remained silent. Not a single confirmed piece of debris was recovered. No bodies surfaced. No floating wreckage drifted ashore. The aircraft had vanished so completely that some investigators privately admitted they had never encountered anything like it. For families waiting for answers, the absence of evidence became its own kind of torment. As the years passed, theories multiplied. Some believed a catastrophic mid-air explosion had destroyed the aircraft instantly. Others suggested sabotage during a tense Cold War era when military operations often carried hidden risks. There were whispers of espionage, secret cargo, and even the possibility that Flight 739 had been carrying information far more valuable than its passengers realized. Without wreckage or flight recorders, every theory remained speculation. The truth lay somewhere beneath the Pacific, or perhaps somewhere never found at all. The ocean, as it has done countless times throughout history, kept it secret. More than 60 years later, Flight 739 remains known as one of aviation's greatest ghost flights. It is a mystery defined not by what investigators discovered, but by what they never found. Somewhere beneath the rolling waves of the Pacific lies an answer waiting in darkness, untouched by sunlight and forgotten by time. Until that answer emerges, Flight 739 endures as a haunting reminder that even in an age of technology and satellites, there are still places on this earth vast enough to make people disappear forever. And sometimes, the most terrifying mysteries are not those with strange evidence, but those that leave behind none at all.